All right, good morning, everybody. I missed you all last week. It's good to see your faces again. I have a couple of reminders before we get started today. One is that last week's lecture will be available to you on Yuja. Yuja is something that you can access through Blackboard. It's what a lot of you will use to record your speeches when you deliver them in class, so you should be pretty familiar with it. Make sure that you watch last week's video. It has some tips in there for memory and delivery, and those should be pretty useful for you. A couple more reminders for you. The second one is all of you should be responsible for completing your plagiarism training. This is something that goes beyond me, goes beyond your lab instructor. This is something that the Department of Communication has implemented for all of its classes. Make sure that you take care of it. The goal for Com 110 is that you all would complete that plagiarism training well before your first major speech. I'm going to give you all a deadline of Friday. Try and complete that. We as a department have decided that if you do not complete that plagiarism training by the end of the semester, you will unfortunately receive an incomplete for the class. I don't want that to happen to any of you. It's not my policy. It's a policy that goes above me. Please just take care of it. It shouldn't take you very long, and it should prepare you well for delivering your own speeches. The third reminder I have for you all is that last week I was going to issue a survey just on your instruction in the course up until this point. It would ask questions about what your lab instructor is doing well and what they can work on. It'll ask questions about me as your lecture instructor. What are some things I'm doing well? What are some things I can work on? I wanted to do that pretty early in the semester because your lab instructors and I are not mind readers. We like to know what's going on. If we don't know that there is a problem with something that we're doing, we can't exactly fix it. And so if you want to give us feedback, whether that feedback is positive or negative, you'll have the opportunity to do that. I have not sent those out yet, but I'll let you know when they're coming. They should probably come out this week, and they'll be due on Sunday if they do come out this week. The goal, again, is to help you get better instruction from Com 110, so please do take the time to fill those out. Those are required surveys for this course. Now, I'll tell you, today we're going to start off talking about audience analysis, and this is one of my favorite lessons to teach in Com 110. I think it's probably one of the most important lessons to teach in Com 110. We've spent the last few weeks together talking about the 5 canons of rhetoric, and a lot of the canons are designed to help you give your speeches. It's a whole process from beginning to end of how to give your speeches. You should be pretty familiar with that process. You should have had lots of opportunities to practice that process. You should be going through the steps of that process for your first speech. But I'll also tell you that there's more to public speaking than just the 5 canons, obviously. And part of the reason why I liked expanding upon the 5 canons is because they are very speaker-centered. And as a speaker-centered model of communication, they often feed into what I like to call students or speakers being self-centered. And when I call you all self-centered, I'm not saying that you're being arrogant. I'm not saying that you're all narcissists. I'm not being mean to you in any capacity. What I'm saying is that a lot of people approach speech from the perspective of, I have to give a speech, what do I have to do to get myself ready? I have communication apprehension, how am I going to overcome that? I don't have the most expressive style, how am I going to make this sound good? They approach speech as if it's a one-way process where the speaker does all the work and the audience's only job is to listen. But if you think about it, every speech that you give, you're trying to accomplish something. At the basic minimum, and I hope a lot of you will see it as more than this, but at the basic minimum for this class, you're trying to pass the class, so you have to give a speech. But ideally, the goal of a lot of your speeches is to teach your audience something new, to enjoy yourself while giving the speech, your later speeches in this class to persuade your audience to think differently. Ultimately, your goal is to find your voice, and the best way to find your voice is actually to get out of your own head. I think I've mentioned here before that when I was an undergrad, I first thought I was going to study psychology, and I really liked psychology as the study of the human mind. I fell into communication instead, and I see communication as interpersonal psychology. That is, it's not just about what happens in one person's brain, but it's what happens in the interaction between people's brains. So you'll see up here that I have a Venn diagram of me and you, and that space in the middle is what we can help accomplish through speech. So we're going to talk about audience analysis, not just as a way of making your speeches more effective, but also making your speeches more enjoyable for your audience as well. So audience analysis is not an easy thing to do. Like I said, I'm not a mind reader, so I don't know necessarily what you think I'm doing well or what you think I could work on in lecture. But most speakers are not mind readers. I don't think any of us have developed that capacity yet. Maybe someday it's coming. But until we get to that point, the best that we have are a handful of tools for audience analysis. And we can use these tools to try and figure out what our audience is thinking, what they already know, what they already believe, what they might be open to, what we have to teach them, how we might change their minds on different things. So if you read today's chapter of your textbook, you saw that there are 3 primary ways of doing audience analysis. The first is what we call demographic audience analysis, and that is going to focus on different people's identities. Demographics are things that you will often not have a whole lot of choice over. A lot of you are born into your demographic identities. A lot of you are assigned a gender at birth. A lot of you are a particular age. Your parents maybe raised you with a particular kind of religion or no religion at all. Maybe your parents imparted their politics onto you. Most 18-year-olds, by the time that they get to college, are pretty in line with a lot of what their parents already think. And they don't have a whole lot of control over things like their race or their gender or their socioeconomic class. But nevertheless, we are fascinated with demographics, especially in the United States. I think a lot of that has to do with the rise of sociology as a discipline. But demographic audience analysis is going to ask you all of those characteristics that make you who you are, that you have very little control over, and things that you would often fill out on a form if you are applying for college, or things that people could see about you if they observed you. Some of those things are more hidden than others. You can't tell necessarily by looking at someone what religion they are, or what politics they have. But nevertheless, we use demographics as a kind of shorthand to figure out who's in my audience, what is the makeup of my audience. So before we get too far into the other types of audience analysis, I'd like to do a little bit of demographic audience analysis of this room here. Go ahead and take a look around the room. Just scan the whole room, scan the audience. Try and figure out what you can tell me generally about the demographics of this particular room and this particular audience. I'll give you the categories again here. What are some general observations that you might have here? Who are we? Okay, most of you are around the same age. If I had to guess, I would say most of you are between the ages of 18 and 22. Some of you might be a little older than that. Some of you, if you're doing post-secondary, might be a little bit younger than that. But more or less, you're all in the same age category. You all are probably what a lot of demographers would call Generation Z. I'm kind of on that borderline between millennials and Generation X. But nevertheless, we could make some assumptions on you based on your age. What other characteristics do you notice looking around the room? Yeah? Presumably you've all graduated high school. Again, some of you might be able to do post-secondary where you're taking college credits in high school, but I think all of you have graduated or are about to graduate high school. What else? Yeah?
90% of us are white.
Okay, it's mostly a white audience, right? We don't need to shy away from race. We can say whether the audience here is reflective of the audience in Grand Forks, the audience of North Dakota, the audience of the United States, the audience of the world. I would say that we're probably disproportionately white in this classroom, and that has some effects, whether we want to admit it or not, on how we teach and how you all learn. What other characteristics might you be able to observe? One more? Okay, religion's probably fairly diverse. I'm not entirely sure if that's accurate just knowing what I know about Grand Forks, but it might be the case that in this classroom, the religion's pretty diverse. Grand Forks is pretty Christian. Within Christianity, Grand Forks is pretty Lutheran Christian. You're not going to find a whole lot of people here. There are a handful of Catholics and other Protestants. There are a handful of people who are not Christian. By and large, it's a pretty Christian area. We could also say, yeah. Okay. Sure, so there's an assumption that college campuses are liberal spaces. I don't know, based on my experience in Grand Forks, I don't know that to be true. I have, generally in my classroom, a pretty even split of liberals and conservatives. A lot of the speeches that I see tend to lean conservative. I think that has a lot to do with the region that we're in. North Dakota as a state leans pretty conservative, but nevertheless, there might be more liberals in Grand Forks or in our classroom than we would see otherwise. That's fair. Any other observations we can make? You had your hand up. What were you going to say? No, okay. What about gender? What do you see? pretty evenly split, right? So we might want to take that into consideration as well. You might say things if you're with people of similar gender that you wouldn't say in front of people of the opposite gender, things like that. We can talk about demographics. We're going to talk about demographics a lot. That's usually the first place people go when they talk about audience analysis, is they can look at those observable characteristics. Again, most demographics are things that you can see on a person if you look at them, although sometimes you might guess wrong, and there are certainly categories that you can't tell just by looking at someone. But nevertheless, we use demographics as indicators. If people belong to a particular group, they're likely to have this kind of life experience. They're likely to believe these kinds of things. They're likely to fit the dominant culture in these ways. They're likely to deviate from the dominant culture in other ways. We use demographics as a shorthand to try and figure out how we might tailor our messages as speakers and as other people who put out messages. The second type of audience analysis is what we call psychographic analysis. Rather than looking at characteristics of who somebody is, what psychographic analysis tries to do is to figure out what people are thinking. So if you were trying to do psychographic analysis, you're actually trying to tell what are people thinking right now. Based on some things that I can observe about you, I could guess that some of you are still a little tired. Maybe you just woke up. Maybe this is your first class of the day. Maybe some of you are hungry. Maybe some of you are bored. Maybe some of you, this is the most exciting thing that's going to happen to you today. I don't know. And psychographic analysis is pretty hard to do. There's not a lot that we can tell psychographically just from looking at people. But psychographically is what we're trying to accomplish with audience analysis. We want to know what people believe, what their attitudes are toward particular things, what their current behaviors are, how we might change those attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors. Psychographic analysis is a little harder to come by because we can't see it when we look at people most of the time. So if you were to try and figure out what's going on in people's heads, and let's say you're a social scientist, how would you go about trying to figure out what people believe about your speech topic? What are some ways that you could do that? Okay, so you could straight up ask people. And how would you ask them? Would you ask them? Okay, you might send out a survey. That's one of the ways I'm trying to do psychographic audience analysis about my teaching. You all are going to get a survey from me. It's going to ask you questions. What are your thoughts about my teaching? Are there other ways that we could ask those questions? Yeah? Okay, so sometimes we get some nonverbal cues or verbal cues from how people present their faces. If they're leaning forward, it means they're probably listening. If they're nodding and smiling, they probably like what you have to say. If they're falling asleep or storming out of the room, they're probably not too happy with it, right? Any other ways we could get at psychographics? Yeah. Ask questions. So maybe we interview our participants. If there's only a handful of people, we say, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? Sometimes we might even do lab experiments and see how people react to different things. There's a good study coming out of Harvard called the implicit bias test. It's a really interesting one. It pairs different categories of things with different presumptions of good and bad. Often it'll pair different groups of people. So it might be racial implicit bias, and it would pair black and white with associations of things that you think might be good or bad, and it'll ask you to rapid fire answer how quickly you can categorize those things, and it might tell you if you have some implicit racist bias. That's one way that those social scientists have tried to do psychographic audience analysis. There's a third type that doesn't have to do quite so much with what people are thinking or who they are. The third type has more to do with what's happening in the room when you're giving your speech. The third type is what we call situational audience analysis, and this is one that I do every day in here. I know that I'm going to get different reactions out of you as my 11 o'clock Tuesday class than I get out of my 2 o'clock Monday class. It just has to do with the time of day. I'm not going to say what those different reactions are, but I can tell how much audience engagement I'm going to get out of each group. Some of that might have to do with who's in the room, but I can tell from a lot of those facial expression cues or those nonverbal cues how well you're listening, how well you're participating. But situational audience analysis is about a lot more than that. It has to do with the time of day. It has to do with what else is going on. It has to do with where you are. It has to do with what's happening in the room. So one thing about situational audience analysis is I know today is a particularly cold day. It's not quite as cold as last week, but I see a lot of you in jackets. You look like you might be a little bit uncomfortable. I'll also tell you that I taught a 5-week-long summer class in Texas, and in the room that I taught in, we had no air conditioning. And it was like an hour and a half every day where I was talking, and there were 2 little ceiling or swivel fans at the front of the room that would go back and forth. And if you happen to be in the way of the swivel fans, it would feel pretty good for a second or two, but it was pretty miserable in there. So I had to change up my teaching based on the fact that my students every day were coming in hot and tired and sweaty and not really wanting to be there. So situational audience analysis has to do with how you adjust for your delivery in the moment. All three of these are designed to help you figure out how you might better reach your audience, getting you out of that self-centered mindset of, I'm the speaker and the only thing that matters is the decisions that I make. Each individual audience member is a human being. They all have thoughts, they all have beliefs, they all have attitudes. They might agree with what you're talking about, and you might just be motivating them to further agree with you, but you also might have to do some work to get them into your camp. All three of these can be pretty useful ways of trying to figure out how to reach your audience, but nevertheless, they can also backfire. The biggest one that probably backfires is demographic audience analysis. So we're going to spend a lot of time today debunking why demographic audience analysis would be the best way of doing audience analysis. I generally think it's not. I think it leads to a lot of problems. We'll get there when we get there. Now, I talked to you about demographics. I gave you all those different categories. To see how this plays out in action, I'm going to have you visualize for a second. Imagine that you are, it's election season, and you are getting ready for campaigns. I've pulled out an example. This example happens to be one that a friend of mine wrote his master's thesis about. This was the 2008 election. You can tell that the speaker up here is Barack Obama. You make me feel old for a second. Show me on your hands how old some of you were in 2008, if you can. I'm seeing a lot of 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s. So a lot of you were pretty young in 2008. I'll tell you that I was graduating. I actually wrote my undergrad honors thesis about Barack Obama's first inaugural address. A good friend of mine wrote his master's thesis about this particular video. In the 2008 election campaign, Barack Obama decided he really wanted to reach his audience. He does not fit the traditional mold of who has been president in the United States. He was the first black man to be president of the United States. He decided that he was going to craft a video with will.i.am from the Black Eyed Peas called Yes We Can. Yes We Can was a theme of his campaign. It came out of a speech that he had given prior to the campaign. It was a speech that resonated with a lot of people. And so Barack Obama teamed up to have clips of this speech playing as a campaign ad for himself. It went viral back in the day when Twitter was new. It was one of those big videos that a lot of people saw and a lot of people had very strong reactions to. The reason for that is because not only was Obama somebody who historically was part of a group that had not yet been president, but he was trying to campaign to people who otherwise felt like they weren't represented very well in US electoral politics. And so you have this message, Yes We Can. We have someone saying it, Si se puede in Spanish. We have someone signing it. I don't know the sign language for it. And finally, we have someone saying in Hebrew, Ken anu yecholim, yes we can. All of these people throughout this video are interspersed with the music from will.i.am and the speech from Barack Obama. A lot of people felt very polar reactions to this speech and Obama's use of demographic audience analysis. If you liked this kind of message, or if you think you would like this kind of message, even if it's not you personally, if someone were to like this kind of message, why do you think that might have worked for them? Anybody want to venture why that would be effective? Or maybe we do the opposite. If that's something that maybe would make you a little upset or uncomfortable, why might that be? Yeah. Political bias, right? So a lot of liberals liked this, a lot of conservatives did not like this. A lot of Democrats were very excited about it. A lot of Republicans were on Fox News or other candidates were campaigning and saying, this doesn't feel right. So why? What does demographic audience analysis do? Why is it so polarizing? Yeah, so it divides up the audience into multiple groups. A lot of people probably have to band together demographic audience identities in order to make a coherent electoral body. And so if he's targeting particular groups, each individual group might not have a whole lot of voting power on its own, but collectively they might be able to come together. Even if your group is not represented in one of the languages at the bottom, you might say, well, at least he's catering to some of these people who otherwise would not probably hear a whole lot of messages from politicians. A lot of people on the right side of politics, a lot of people, conservatives, were saying, this message is pandering. They're saying he's just using these people and these languages and just talking to these very specific groups in order to try and get elected, and as soon as he gets elected, he's going to stop caring about them. We have a common assumption, I think, in the United States that our politicians don't have our best interests in mind. So a lot of people were very excited that their group was being represented by a candidate for president. A lot of people were very excited that they historically had not been included in a candidate's message this way. And a lot of people also saw it as very off-putting. They said that he's targeting a little bit too closely. It feels a little bit disingenuous. It feels like it's just all fluff and no substance. Now that gets us into this idea of what we would call target audiences. Has anybody heard the phrase target audience before? Go ahead and raise your hand. I won't make you define it. A handful of you have heard of this phrase before. Now, a target audience is looking at a group that's very large and saying, I'm not going to try and reach every single person in that group, but I'm going to try and reach as many people as I possibly can within a very narrow subset of that group. So sometimes your target audience will be demographics. I see a lot of television shows trying to cater to young adults between the ages of 18 and 34. That excludes teenagers and people younger than them. That excludes older people. And so we have a lot of people who will narrow in a target audience message, and they'll focus on a subset of the group, people who speak Spanish or are Latino, people who are not Christian, people who don't speak, or people who might have different learning differences, or there's lots of different ways that you can narrow that down. A lot of targeted audiences will look specifically at a group and say, I'm going to cater to only women. I'm going to cater only to people who are interested in cheese. I don't know. It can get very narrow and very specific, and as a result of narrowing down your audience, you're not talking to everyone, but the people you are talking to are getting very focused, targeted messages. This is that experience that you go through when you are on social media, and either an advertisement either gets you perfectly and you're creeped out by how well the algorithm knows you, and you're like, it just recommended this product that I was thinking about 2 days ago. How does it know me that well? It's also the same thing that goes wrong when you get weird advertisements. For a while last fall, I don't know why, I was getting weird advertisements for cheetah print yoga pants. And I can tell you there's no way I will buy cheetah print yoga pants, but Facebook somehow, for some reason, thought that's what I wanted. It is not what I wanted. So audience analysis and targeted audiences can be a really effective way of reaching a very specific group of people. And the reason that that works is because people like to think that they're being paid attention to. People like to feel special. People like it when they feel like other people understand them. There's also a reason why this backfires a lot of the time. It's those things that don't quite work so well when people get you wrong. Now, Dr. Pepper, for instance, had an ad about 1.5 years ago that they released called Dr. Pepper 10, It's Not for Women. And a lot of people who were in that target audience of women, and also a lot of people who were not in that target audience of men, or both, actually it's both in this case, were kind of offended by this. Because targeted advertising often backfires in ways that the people who craft it don't intend. So what we have here is a company basically telling us who we are, but also who we should be. By saying Dr. Pepper 10, it's not for women, what they're saying is that it's a low-calorie soda. What they're saying is traditionally only women should care about their weight. We're going to cater this toward men, and we're going to say men shouldn't care about their weight, but for those men who do care about your weight, you should care about your weight, but you can still drink our product. And this got a ton of backlash on social media. There's a lot of other advertisements that sexualize various products. There's a particular Burger King one that you all can look up that was pretty bad a few years ago. Lots of backlash to target advertisements. Now, I'm going to have you watch a couple examples of this, and part of why I'm going to have you do that is so that you all can get better at resisting targeted messages. A lot of them are very powerful, a lot of them are very persuasive, and you want to be able to recognize that feeling of, oh, they get me, oh, this feels nice, I'm included, can sometimes be very manipulative. I want you to be able to resist those kinds of messages when you recognize that it's happening to you. So we're going to look at a couple different commercials that are targeted toward particular groups. You can try and narrow down who this is being targeted toward. try to be as specific as possible. I'll pull up that list of all the different demographic categories, but take some notes as we watch this. I'm going to show you a set of commercials about beer commercials first. I'll tell you that before I show you this product, I am not endorsing this product, A, because I'm guessing a lot of you are under 21, B, it happens to be for Milwaukee's Best light beer, and Milwaukee's Best is terrible, and you all, when you're able to drink, can do better. Nevertheless, we're going to watch an advertisement for or a series of advertisements for Milwaukee's Best beer. Try and figure out who this is being targeted toward. And after that, try and figure out what it's saying about members of that group and who they are and who they should be. Okay?
Men should act like men, and light beer should taste like beer. Milwaukee's Best Light.
Better flavoring, that's going to increase the pressure off.
Look at that little dog. You're just a fluffy little dog. Come here, I'll rub your little belly. Yeah.
Men should act like men, and light beer should taste like beer. Milwaukee's Best Light.
You're going to bet
Guys,
this
I gotta go out to the car. I'll be right back.
Anyway.
Hey, honey. How are you? I'm just calling to check in.
Men should act like men, and light beer should taste like beer. Milwaukee's Best Light.
Well, he struck another guy with a sinker, if you remember. Mm-hmm. You're talking man sinker.
Men should act like men, and light beer should taste like beer. Milwaukee's Best Light.
Fellas, how's it going? What?
Men should act like men, and light beer should taste like beer. Milwaukee's Best Light.
All right, so you just watched a handful of advertisements. I'll tell you that when I was in your shoes, one of my professors decided to torture me and have me write a 7 to 10 paper analyzing the audience of this particular set of commercials. I'll tell you that I did get an A on that paper. Nevertheless, we can talk a little bit about those demographics and why they might be problematic. So let's take a look at who we have here. Who is being targeted in that series of advertisements? Let's start with the obvious. Who's being targeted? Men. Within the category of men, are there specific demographics that you could point to? Yeah. Okay, masculinity. They want manly men, right? If you don't act in a traditionally, stereotypically masculine way, you're going to get crushed by a giant beer can. Okay? Any other categories that we could say? Yeah.
I assume that they're targeting lower class.
Okay, you say lower class. I think you're right, but why do you say that?
Because typically rednecks are considered, lower class.
Okay.
Most of the men in the commercials seem like this is stereotype of redneck.
Okay. So I'd be a little careful with your terminology, but I will say, that's okay. I will say that a lot of the men in this video were probably dressed in ways that would signal lower class. They probably were engaging in activities that we might say are lower class. Nevertheless, we could say that this probably isn't being targeted toward the Trump family. It's probably not being targeted toward the Bezos family. It's probably being targeted toward people maybe who are not from that demographic. We could also recognize that Milwaukee's Best is out of Milwaukee. Milwaukee is historically one of the most, if not the most, segregated cities in the United States. So we could say that this is being targeted toward white men specifically. We could also point out that it's probably not being targeted toward gay and trans men, right? And so there's lots of different assumptions that we could make about what this says. We could decide whether we want to buy this product or not. If you felt like this ad was targeting you, you might be inclined to buy that product, or you might be inclined to say, whoa, that's weird that it's targeting me that way. We're going to watch a second set of commercials that is not targeted toward that audience, and we'll follow up and do the same thing.
How do I feel about my period? We're like this. I love it. I want to hold really soft things, like my hat. It makes me feel really pure. Sometimes I just want to run on the beach. I like to twirl, maybe in slow motion. And I do it in my white spandex. And usually by the third day, I really just want to dance. Ads on TV are really helpful because they use that blue liquid, and I'm like, oh, that's what's supposed to happen.
You like Kotex, and you like tampons, pads, and lights.
I love showing those back to back because all the men get real riled up by the Milwaukee's Best commercials, and then she starts off, why do I like tampons, or what do I think of my period? I love teaching that and just watching your reactions to it. This is also why I teach college and not high school, because you all don't go home at the end of the day and talk to your parents, and they're like, oh, Johnny, what did you learn in school today? Well, we talked about beer and tampons. I don't have to deal with that. In fact, legally, I'm not allowed to talk to your parents, which is kind of wonderful. Let's go ahead and do some audience analysis here as well. What are some things you notice about who's being targeted here and why? Start with the obvious. Who's being targeted? Women. More specifically, any kind of women? Okay, women of age who can menstruate. We can get awkward in here. I can use that term. I'm comfortable. I'm married. I have older sisters. So women who are of age where they still get their periods. What makes you know not just the obvious of this is a product that they could use, but is there anything in the commercial that signals maybe a younger demographic? Okay, there's a little bit of sarcasm that's usually associated with youth. That's a good point. Yep. People who are active, they're not sitting at home on their couch watching soap operas, not to stereotype, but, right? Bright colors. A lot of tampons use pastels as their colors. This is bright pink and bright yellow, just targeting toward teenagers and young adults. What is it saying about targeted advertising generally? Recognize this is a commercial, but it's also a critique of this exact idea of a targeted audience. Maybe I went a little too meta for you. What I'm trying to say here is that by showing you an ad that's critiquing targeting, it's saying all these other ads show women in these ways. They say women should behave like this. They say women should behave like this, but not you. You're different. You're special. It's really interesting to see the ways that targeted advertising can spin on itself and even kind of undermine itself. And so it's calling attention to people trying to sell you products based on your demographics, but it's also in the same way trying to sell you a product. If you happen to catch the name of that product, it's You by Kotex. You, I'm talking to you specifically, you are special, you are included, I'm targeting you, but also it's You by Kotex. Kind of on a subtle level, it's you should go out and buy Kotex is kind of what they're saying. So demographics can be a way of getting people to pay attention. It can be a way of getting people to feel special. When you're in that space between me and you in that Venn diagram that I put at the beginning, a lot of people will relate to you. They'll engage in a process that communication scholars call identification. If I see you as similar to me, if I think your interests are aligned with my interests, I might have otherwise been skeptical, but I'm probably going to listen. And that's part of why targeted advertising works. Now, let's talk about some ways that demographic audience analysis might be able to help you. Can you think of some ways if you're about to give your speech, if you're scanning the room in your lab section, how might that help you craft your speech? What kinds of decisions might you make based on the demographics? Okay, so you might add some humor into it if you happen to know what kinds of humor will appeal to your audience. A lot of times humor is funny to people of the same background, but sometimes humor can backfire, so maybe you want to be careful with that humor as well. It'll help determine your overall subject matter. What might be interesting to your audience? If you're having a hard time with invention and topic selection, it might help you narrow that down a little bit. Are there other ways demographic audience analysis might be able to help you? You probably want to be a little bit careful with things that might be offensive. You might say things in company of people who are like you that you would not say in company of people who are different from you. Now, a lot of people like to use demographic audience analysis as a way to get at psychographic analysis. We have a lot of assumptions that people from group X believe X. People from group Y do this particular thing. People from group Z think this thing is funny and that thing's offensive. I want to tell you to be very careful with demographic audience analysis because there's a lot of ways that it can go wrong. Probably the biggest way that demographic audience analysis can go wrong is through stereotyping. You can try to appeal to a group of people by talking like them if they talk differently from you, dressing like them if they dress differently from you. A lot of people in those groups will see that as appropriation. They will see that not as a way of identifying, but actually as a way of corrupting or co-opting who they are and what their culture is. So you want to be very careful with stereotypes. It's easy to say if somebody belongs to a particular group that I know who they are. I know if they're a Republican or a Democrat. I know if they like this thing and not that thing. You want to be very careful with stereotypes. The other thing that can backfire with demographic audience analysis is making assumptions about people. It's similar to stereotypes, but if you assume that people belong to a particular group, they might not actually identify that way, and you can try to identify with them in ways that actually push them away further. I learned in high school a phrase that's not the most appropriate phrase, but I still like it for teaching college students, and that is never assume. Has anybody heard this phrase before? Never assume because what? Good. Never assume because it makes an ass out of you and me. I like that because there are a lot of people who will make assumptions when they get up to speak, and they think that more people are inclined to agree with them than actually are, and oftentimes that actually makes people feel alienated and uncomfortable. I'll give you another example of this. This happens to come from one of my favorite comedians. This is Margaret Cho in a bit back in the 90s. In the late 80s and early 90s, Margaret Cho had a show on ABC called All American Girl. You can probably see from her demographics that Margaret Cho is an Asian American. She happens to come from South Korea. She is first generation Asian American. She came over here. She was on this show, All American Girl, that had a whole bunch of stereotypes about immigrants and about people from Asian countries. She nevertheless was interested in being part of the show, and it was a way for her to get some exposure. It was prior to the time when Asian American characters were more commonplace in our TV screens and in movies and things like that. Now, the producers of All American Girl said, okay, Margaret, we want to do a promotional commercial for the show. Will you be in our promo ad? And you can see they make some assumptions about who she is, and those assumptions kind of backfire. They kind of make asses out of the producers.
Then there were people who didn't understand the concept of Asian American. I went on a promotional tour for the TV show, and I went all over the country, and I went to one morning show, and the announcer said, hey Margaret, we're changing over to an ABC affiliate, so why don't you tell our viewers in your native language we're making that transition. So I looked at the camera and I said, they're changing to an ABC affiliate.
Now, obviously, these people assume that because Margaret Cho was Korean American, that her first language was Korean, her first language was English, and they looked pretty stupid after that. She goes on in the same bit to talk about how they asked her on the show, hey, Margaret, you can go ahead and eat with chopsticks, and then when you're done eating with chopsticks, why don't you go ahead and put them in your hair? Ladies, show of hands, how many of you would eat a meal with chopsticks and then put them in your hair? Yeah, didn't think so, right? It's a little bit uncomfortable, and so we want to be careful. Even some things that we think are well-meaning can backfire on us. And this takes me into a conversation that I really want to have with you all, and it's a conversation that's getting a lot of attention again lately. It kind of cycles in and out of favor with different groups. The concept is the idea of political correctness. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands in a second here. And you can raise your hands and you can say, I don't know what political correctness means, and that's okay. I want you to be honest if that's the case. If you do know what it means, you can say either you think it's necessary and important, you think it's stupid, or you have mixed feelings about it. I'm not here to judge. I just want to have a conversation because I think it's an important conversation for us to have in a public speaking classroom. So raise your hand if you have never heard of political correctness before. You're not entirely sure what it means. That's okay. Raise your hands. A couple of you. Okay. Somebody who is familiar with the term political correctness, can you give us a working definition? It doesn't have to be perfect, but what are we talking about? Anybody willing to try? All right, y'all are a little quiet today. I'm going to break you of that habit. I'll go ahead and get us working here. Political correctness, as it's often talked about, has a lot of different definitions, and that's why some people are kind of confused about it. To some people, political correctness is about trying not to offend people. It's about not using particular terms if those terms are outdated. It's about trying not to be offensive. It's about trying not to create what we might call, using Title IX, a hostile environment for people. For other people, it's very uncomfortable, and it's this idea that you can't speak your mind and that you can't say certain things and certain terms or certain ideas are forbidden. Essentially, what political correctness means, it has nothing to do with politics per se. A lot of people like to associate political correctness with Democrats or with liberals. There are versions of political correctness on all sides of the political spectrum. What it essentially means is that you're trying not to offend people through your speech. So, if you happen to know what political correctness is, raise your hand if you think that it's necessary and important. Handful of you. Raise your hand if you think it's stupid. Handful of you. Raise your hand if you think you have mixed feelings about it. At least half of you, okay? So a lot of people have pretty mixed feelings about it. I think it's important for us to talk about it not just from a right or wrong ethical kind of standpoint, but rather also from a practical standpoint with public speaking. So let's start off with the people who said they think it's stupid. It's okay if this is your perspective or someone else's perspective. What are some problems that people generally have with political correctness?
Personally, I feel like by being overly PC, you validate the reasons why they're bad. So by not letting them, I guess, by making them such taboo words, you're pretty much empowering them for that reason.
Okay, so if we make things off limits, people like to gravitate toward those things that we say, you can't do that. People say, watch me, hold my beer, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? Right? Another way of putting it also is that sometimes when we can't use particular terms, we often avoid conversations about things that are problematic. So if we can't be sexist, if we can't be racist, if we can't say those particular things, then people are kind of walking on eggshells, and when we need to address sexism, when we need to address racism, people don't want to have the conversation at all. They totally tune out from it. I've heard that critique as well. Are there other reasons why people don't like political correctness? Yeah. Okay, a lot of times people will say it's censorship. I have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. I don't want to give up those rights. I'll say whatever I want, and you can't do anything about it. Any others? Yeah. Okay, it might make people feel segregated or isolated. It might put people in camps against one another. Fair? Any other reasons why people don't like political correctness? I'll venture one more that I've heard before, and that is that a lot of people don't like political correctness because they feel like they don't even know how to keep up with what is and is not politically correct. To give you an example, when I was a little kid, if I met an adult who was under, say, 3 or 4 feet tall, the proper term that I learned when I was a little kid was midget. And I came to learn that when I was a little bit older, that term is no longer the PC term, that a lot of people within that demographic prefer to be called little people. And that term still might be changing. Also, when I was a little kid, I was told to call someone Native American or American Indian, or then it shifted to talking to individual tribes like Lakota or Cheyenne, right? So we don't know how to keep up with the terms of political correctness. There's a lot of reasons why people don't like political correctness, but for those of you who think that it's necessary and important, or for those of you who have mixed feelings about it, why might it still matter for us as public speaking practicers or as audience members? So people who speak or people who listen, why might political correctness still be important? Less willing to share? There we go. Okay, it might make you come across as more professional. You can probably think of examples of people who have been fired for things that they've said on Facebook or Twitter, or things that they've said in speeches that they maybe said were taken out of context. Nevertheless, it's not professional. Are there other reasons why it might be important?
If you alienate your audience right away, they kind of immediately go against whatever you're talking about, even if they partially agree.
Good, yeah, if you alienate your audience, it's very hard to recover from that. It's very easy to lose your ethos. It's very hard to get your ethos back. Think about people like Mel Gibson or Britney Spears. A lot of celebrities that we have who have said things or done things that we look at as crazy. As soon as you say something, it's really hard to get anyone in your audience to feel included if you've already excluded them. Are there other reasons why it might be important? Yeah. Yeah, so audience members might not like what you have to say. If you're not careful with your speech, they're probably going to tune out. They probably won't be persuaded. Your mission, your purpose that you're trying to accomplish in your speech probably won't be accomplished. But also, some of you have probably had the experience of being on the butt end of a joke because of who you are and something that you can't control. I know it's happened to me on multiple occasions. A lot of people will have the experience of somebody saying something offensive. Maybe they'll make a joke about your religion. Maybe they'll make a joke about your race, and they're trying to be funny. It usually feels awful when you're on the butt end of that joke. So there's an ethics that goes along with that, and that ethics is what another public speaking instructor calls personal courtesy. That the term political correctness has so much baggage attached to it, all the reasons people hate it, that even in the 90s, people were saying, stop calling it politically correct, call it PC instead. And that's when people lost their minds about political correctness, and they're like, it's gone overboard. But if you're thinking about political correctness, it's not really about being politically correct or saying the right thing or avoiding saying the wrong thing. It's about personal courtesy. It's about not being a jerk. It's about being inclusive. It's about trying to welcome other people into your audience and make them feel accepted. So the basic versions of political correctness is that you want to avoid anything that will make you, the speaker, be perceived as something-ist or something phobic. So we've got racism, we've got sexism, we've got xenophobia, that's fear of foreigners, homophobia, fear of people in the LGBT community, ageism. A lot of you will encounter ageism when you go on the market, and they'll say, well, you're 22, you just graduated, I want someone with 5 years of experience. Some of you also engage in ageism when you talk about your grandparents and you make fun of them. So there's a lot of different categories that people have based on their demographics, and a lot of those categories get people in trouble. It's not to say that you can't talk about race, you can't talk about sex, you can't talk about various things that are controversial. It's not to say that we can't talk about identity and how identity impacts us, but you want to be careful with how you talk about those things. To show you another example of this, there are a lot of times when good intentions go bad. This is an example of a slam poet by Vanessa Hidary. I want you to watch it in part for its message, but in part also because of its use of style. She, as a slam poet, uses a lot of creative language.
I meet a guy in a bar that's cute. He wears LL Bean duck boots and guards my bar stool when I have to go pee. He asked me out to dinner for the following Tuesday. I declined. Tuesday is Yom Kippur. I will be fasting. You're Jewish? Wow. You don't look Jewish. You don't act Jewish. And he says it in this tone that sounds like he's complimenting me. And I say nothing. I say nothing, which combined with a flirty smile translates to thank you. I say nothing because I got a contact high of someone's anti-Semitic crack pipe. I say nothing because somewhere along my life's graph, I've been swayed to believe that being Jewish is not too cool, not too sexy. I say nothing because I'm in a deep sleep, a snow-white coma, destined to meet my prince 5 years later in the form of stone in Jerusalem named the Wailing Wall. I place folded paper with written prayers for the dead in a nook in the wall next to a woman with concentration camp numbers tattooed on her forearm. Surrounded by fervent praying and bodies swaying, I am far more awake than I ever thought possible. I suddenly remember the exodus of the Israelites, and I walk barefoot from the wall in the desert to the bar and look for the guy with the duck boots. He's not there, but I have something to say to him. He's not there, so I make a soapbox and reenact the scene. Bartender, tell me I don't look Jewish. Tell me I don't act Jewish. Because I'm saying, what does Jewish look like to you? Should I fiddle on a fucking roof for you? Should I humor you with oy veys and refuse to pay? Oh, because you know how we like to Jew you down. Jew you down, I'd like to throw you down. Because I walked here long miles on hot sand to publicly repent my sins because I almost forgot. 6 million died without having the option of giggling on bar stools. Almost forgot that concentration camp survivors are now a dying generation. That my children may never have the sensation of seeing in person. And if you must see me as that blood-sucking Jew, see me as that pesky mosquito that bites and sucks the prejudice right out of you. Just feel the need to say I can't be the only exception to the rule. Just the one right now using my poetry as a tool. To follow KRS-One, I will use my gift to only uplift and maybe change just one heart tonight. I'm the Hebrew Mamita, long-lost daughter of Abraham and Sarah. The sexy oy vey, chutzpah having, non-cheaping, non-conspiracizing, always questioning, hip-hop listening, Torah scroll reading, all people loving, pride-filled Jewish girl. Bigging up all people who are a little miffed because someone tells you you don't look like or act like your people. Impossible, because you are your people. You just tell them they don't look, period.
So she might be a little over the top, and that's the point. Nevertheless, I think she has an interesting message that people who have good intentions sometimes nevertheless end up offending people. You want to be very careful. Before you all head out, I just encourage you to read what's up on the board here, because this is how I grade speeches with my lab students. This is how I've instructed your lab instructors to grade when they're grading your speeches. I want you to grade with a mixed audience in mind. And this is what a mixed audience looks like. And once you've done that, you all are free to go, and I'll see you next week.